Shalom, welcome. It is great to be with you all, wherever you are in the world, and to be able to learn together in what some parts of the world might be Erev Yom Kippur, which is just Yamim Noraim, is just a powerful time to reflect in all kinds of ways about our lives and our purpose and our connections. And so it is a delight to do that today with just a wonderful scholar and teacher on this important book that has come out, Going Out with Knots, My Two Kaddish COVID Years with Hebrew Poetry. Rabbi Dr. Wendy Zierler is Sigmund Falk Professor of Modern Jewish Literature and Feminist Studies at HUC-JIR in New York. Prior to joining HUC-JIR, she was a research fellow in the English department at the University of Hong Kong. She received her Ph.D. and her MA from Princeton University and her BA from Stern College of Yeshiva University and an MFA in fiction writing from Sarah Lawrence College. In June 2021, she received rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva Maharat. Her most recent book is Going Out with Knots, My Two Kaddish COVID Years with Hebrew Poetry, published by Jewish Publication Society. That is our conversation today about that book. Actually, I do want to share some of her other books just so you can check those out as well, because I've been able to learn with Rabbi Dr. Wendy Zierler in the past, and her content is really great. Let me name some of those. One is Movies and Midrash, Popular Film and Jewish Religious Conversation. Another is And Rachel Stole the Idols, The Emergence of Hebrew Women's Writing. She's co-editor with Carol Balin of another work, Hebrew Writings of Chava Shapiro, and her English translation of Shapiro's writings, To Tread on New Ground, Selected Writings of Chava Shapiro, also credited by Balin, published in 2014, and a bunch of other books. And I'm actually going to post them in the chat here on both the live stream and in the Zoom, so you can learn more about these books, which are really great. And so with that, thank you for joining wherever you are. And Rabbi Dr. Wendy Zierler, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Okay, hi, good evening, everybody. I'm going to be sharing my screen so that you can see, can you all see the PowerPoint? Just thumbs up.
Yes.
Wonderful. So this is a very different book than the other books that I've written. I'm a professor, and so I've spent most of my career writing works of scholarship. This book comes from a much more personal place, and so I'm going to have to tell you some personal stories to be able to get us into the text study. You can see the cover of the book here at the beginning of the PowerPoint. These two individuals over here are my parents, Marion and David Zierler. This is a picture of them in the old city. The occasion was their first visit to Israel in 1968. So this is them going out with connection to Israel. And the book in large part is a tribute to my parents, but you'll see many other things. The impetus for the book, it began with a pretty tragic story, which is on March 12th, 2019, my father was getting out of his car in a parking lot in Toronto, where I grew up, and was hit by a truck and instantly killed by a distracted truck driver. This occurred a week after I had secured a green card for my father, who is a Canadian citizen. My mom at the time was chronically ill, and we always worried about what would happen to him if she succumbed to her illness. And so we found ourselves very unexpectedly going to Toronto for a very different reason than what I had hoped would at that. So this was in March of 2019. I had expected 2 weeks later to go and hand deliver my father his green card so that he could use it to enter into the United States when they came on a visit for Pesach. And so we had to shift course. the book basically begins with that tragedy, um, which the grief of that was only compounded by subsequent events. Um, After my father's death, we heroically moved my mother to Toronto, from Toronto to Riverdale, where I live. Um, and we're just really watching her finally get settled when some 5 months after her move, she passed away, which was 5 days before what was supposed to have been the end of the Kaddish for my dad. So I effectively was saying Kaddish for 22 straight months. And then that was in January of 2020, uh, exactly a year after my father's death. So March 12th, 2020, you may recall, that was the day of the COVID shutdown in New York. And so what had been a prolonged story of private grief basically melded into a whole universal global story of adversity. Um, the private very much being overshadowed by what everybody was going through. Um, so the book that I'm going to be telling you about, in many respects, traces that process, a kind of translation from personal to public grief. But before that, I am going to tell you a few more stations in this journey. So this, by the way, is the news story that came out uh, of my father's death. This was before they had told us. There was a report in the Toronto newspaper, so it just refers to a 90-year-old pedestrian. Um, as many of you know, it's customary in the shloshim, the first 30 days after a loved one dies, the family engages in the practice of studying Mishnah in memory of the departed. And my family was no exception to this. I took it upon myself to when I signed up, they have these apps nowadays where people can sign up for their Mishnah allotment. And when I decided on what I wanted to study, I had in mind my father's own particular life story, which involved making great sacrifices for the sake of Shabbat observance. My family comes from a small town in Western Ontario. For my father's entire life, until he was 47 years old, he lived in this small town. They had a thriving furniture business. And like most people in the Jewish community in Sarnia, it was a good life. My parents enjoyed a good life, but they had Judaism on their minds. We were the one observant Jewish family in this Jewish community. And after my father's father passed away, my parents made the decision to give up this business and moved the family to Toronto so that my father could stop working on Shabbat. He had a furniture business, and my father used to say, when people asked him if he worked on Shabbat in Sarnia, he said, "I didn't work on Shabbat, I slaved on Shabbat." So the family made the decision, which was very countercultural among their friends and family members, to give up the business so that he could stop working on Shabbat and so that we could go uh, to Jewish schools. And so when I thought of what I wanted to learn in my father's memory, I could not think of anything better than to study the Mishnayot of Shabbat. But I had a bit of a shocking journey around that experience. And I'm telling you about this as a way of explaining for you what might seem at first blush an oddball title for a book. I'm referring to the title Going Out with Knots. I actually had to uh, fight with my publishers, stick to my guns about this title because I knew that it was significant to the whole metaphorical structure of the book, but it requires a bit of a journey to understand. So the the I was back at home with my mother, taking care of her after my father died, um, and so I was saying Kaddish in my parents' shul, and my mother was aware that I had for many years taken on the mitzvah of wearing a talit when I davened, when I prayed, and so she decided to give me my father's talit. That's the talit that is featured on the front of the cover of the book. And the very first morning that I was wearing my father's talit at Minyan, I had taken with me my Mishnayot Shabbat, And the Mishnah that I studied that morning, I kid you not, this is exactly what had happened. I didn't make it up. The Mishnah that I studied is this one from Shabbat 6:9, which says, young boys may go out on Shabbat. Well, I'm going to say first in Hebrew. Habanim yotzim biksharim, uvnei melachim bezogim, v'chol adam, ela shedibru chachamim behoveh. Translated as such. Young boys may go out on Shabbat with knots, and princes with bells, and any person is permitted to go on Shabbat, out on Shabbat with, we're not sure if it's referring to the knots or the bells. However, the sages spoke in the present. So as you can imagine, there's a certain perplexity that arises from studying this Mishnah. What are these ksharim? What are these knots that the sages were speaking about that one can go out wearing on Shabbat? The question, of course, has to do with what is considered proper clothing and what is something that you would be carrying that's not part of your clothing or not even considered accessible accessories that one may not wear on Shabbat. And so it appears that these knots are some kind of accessible accessory for banim, for sons, specifically younger men. And the question is, what are they? I'll come back to the Mishnah in a bit. So that morning, when I was studying this for the first time, I read the commentary of the Bartanura, whose days are 1445 to 1515, one of the most important commentators, or the canonical commentators on the Mishnah, and he glosses these not ksharim as follows: Ben sheyesh lo ga'aguim al aviv, a son who has longings for his father. And of course, we'll see that this is influenced by the Talmud's exegesis of this. Ben sheyesh lo ga'aguim al aviv notel ha'av retzua shel min al yamin v'koshra lo laben bismolo. So a son who has longings for his father, the father takes a strap of the right shoe and ties it to the child, either onto the child's left shoe or to his left arm, and all the while that this tie is upon him, the chol zman she'oto kesher alav sarim hagaguim me'alav bisgula. So long as the boy has this knot on his arm or on his shoe, these longings that he would have for his father seem to go away talismanically or in some sort of special providential way. So then, of course, the question is asked, why banim and lo banot? Well, why sons and not daughters? And so what does the Bartanura say? Ulahachi tane habanim she'en labanot gaguim alavihen kemo habanim. Why is it that the Mishnah speaks specifically of sons, not of daughters? For daughters don't have longings for their fathers. So here I was, involved in, I had just committed myself recently to the project of saying Kaddish for my father, whom I was very, very close with. I spoke to him every single day. He and I had been involved in a writing project for several years. And I'm wrapped in his talit. You can say, wrapped in his knots. And my tradition that I am trying to tie myself to is telling me that daughters don't have longings for their fathers. And there I was in shul, the only woman on the women's side, and I literally let out a gasp. Like, what? I said, what? How could that possibly be? Here I am in this very process of learning this Mishnah in his memory. And the Mishnah was as if like forming a fist and punching me in the gut. And things didn't get better as I searched around for commentators on it. The Gemara goes to some lengths to try and figure out why, it takes as axiomatic that it's sons and not daughters. And at first it conjectures that maybe these knots were some sort of medicinal knot, but says, well, if it's medicine, daughters can use it too. And actually, it's not just sons or younger folks, but adults can use them. So then it moves to this idea that we saw in the Bartzenura about it being some sort of talismanic knot, a way of creating an attachment in a circumstance of detachment. And what made matters even worse for me is when I read Rabbeinu Hananel's interpretation of it, he specifically set this situation of the sun going out with knots in a time of grief and loss, that it was when the son had lost his father. The father had died, that the son would be allowed to go out wearing this knot as a kind of memory, a reminder that would let the longings, the gaguim for the father go away. I'm going to raise the agitation around this Mishnah even further through an exploration of what Rashi says in his commentary on this question of Habanim Yotzim B'Ksharim. Rashi says, Gaguim, he glosses it in like old French as bar murt, like an excessive sort of love, an extra love. Mega'agea alav ve'no yachol lipared mimenu. He longs him and he can't separate from him. Ve'refuah zo lo shaycha b'nekevot. And this sort of medicine or talisman is not relevant when it comes to females. שאין האב מחבבן כל כך מתחילתן שיהיו מגעגעים עליו. That a father will never show enough love for his daughter from her very inception, from her very beginnings, that she would cultivate those sorts of longings, that she would ever miss him. Okay, well, I'm going to give you a little bit of background before I move on to this poem, if I can get my. Don't know why I'm having this problem. Oh, here. No. Okay. So what I realized as two things that I'd like to say. I was quite agitated by this experience, and I was very much looking for ways for the experience of Kaddish, even though it can be challenging for Orthodox women within the Orthodox prayer framework to say Kaddish. I had, generally speaking, found a pretty hospitable home at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, which is the home of Maharat, a place that has been committed as much as possible to try and stretch the parameters of how women can participate and to include women. Nevertheless, the experience that I had of encountering this Mishnah made me aware of the fact that I was going to need to avail myself of other sources, not just the ones that come on the page of our traditional prayer book, or even from rabbinic sources, that I was going to need to somehow take advantage of the language of today and the creativity of today. And in this, I was given a bit of a prod and an assist by one of my teachers at Maharat, Rabbi Jeff Fox, who, when I expressed how agitated I was by this Mishnah, he referred me to the language of the Mishnah, which is Uvnei melachim bezogim v'chol adam, right? I'll go back again to the Mishnah. Habanim yotzim b'ksharim. Young boys may go out with knots, and princes with bells. But then the Mishnah follows and says, actually, apropos of the bells, anyone can go out wearing bells. Once upon a time, there was this distinction between aristocrats and everyday people. But nowadays, we're ready to dismiss those distinctions. Ela shedibru chachamim behoveh. But the sages were using the parlance of their day in mentioning the fact that only princes would go out with bells. And Rabbi Falk said, you can read this Mishnah and apply the ending, Ela shedibru chachamim behoveh, that the sages were speaking in the language of their time, to apply to the sons going out with knots too. In other words, sons and daughters can go out with knots. But more specifically, I realized that he was opening the door to this idea of Lishon Hoveh, how important it would be, what an important resource it is to be able to expand the resources for comfort or for engagement or for learning beyond what we might see in classical sources. And what I ended up doing, as I took, in addition to the discipline of saying Kaddish 3 times a day, I decided to take on a weekly regimen where every Tuesday, my father was killed on a Tuesday, and there were, as is detailed in my book, there were a number of misfortunes that occurred to my family on Tuesdays, despite the double good kitov associations with Tuesday. We've had some repeated difficult Tuesdays. And I decided that every Tuesday morning, since there's a Devar Torah rotation at our synagogue, at the end of Tefillah in the morning, a different member of the synagogue gives a Devar Torah so that we can add on an additional rabbi's Kaddish. So what I decided to do is take on a discipline where every Tuesday I would teach a class that I came to call Shir Chadash Shel Yom. It has been going on now for 6 years, every Tuesday morning after the 6:45 minyan. And it involved taking a modern Hebrew poem. I'm a scholar of modern Hebrew literature, translating it, and then offering it in the form of a Devar Torah, either related to the experience of reciting Kaddish or related to prayer or related to other matters of the day. For the past year, it's been a weekly Torah commentary. And that became my language of Hoveh. That became my way of being able to offer something, some variation to the experience of reciting Kaddish, which can be highly, grindingly repetitive. If one thinks about how many of the tefillot you say repeatedly in a given day, as a woman, recognizing that there is not a single prayer in the traditional prayer book that is authored by a woman. I mean, there were options. We could have included the Miriam part in HUC-JIR, in the Song of the Sea, in the Daily Shacharit, but it's not included. And so this idea that there was not a single prayer written in a woman's voice was another thing that was grinding, that was weighing on me. And the Shir Chadash became a way to include women's voices, to include creativity, to include in the liturgy a kind of disposition of doubt and protest and everyday life and things that and the pronoun I, personal experience. So all of these became a way of being able to supplement and take me on this journey through mourning. And but at the end of 2 years, I had 104 poems. 53 of them made it into the book. For those of you who will read the book, you'll see that, of course, it ramifies and it goes beyond. While it follows my personal experience, it takes us into a number of the events that were occurring in 2020 and 2021 as well. So apropos of this theme of going out with knots, I chose 3 poems, we'll see how far we get, that are explicitly on that theme of going out with knots. And if there's time, I have another one after that. I will note in the poem, the way the Shir Chadash worked is that I would choose one poet and live with that poet for about 6 months, so that the congregation would learn about the poet in a whole range of modes. The first poet that I chose was Leah Goldberg. I hope that we get to the last poem that I chose. It's a Leah Goldberg poem, dedicated, called to my mother. And I taught that when my mother was still alive, when I had just moved her to Riverdale, and I was negotiating that new experience of having a mom nearby, having not lived near my parents my entire adult life. But yeah, so the first poet was Leah Goldberg. The second is a lesser known Israeli poet named Avram Chalfi, who is very well known in Israel because Arik Einstein set a lot of his poems to music, but had really not been translated at all. So all of the translations in the book are my original translations. Then after Avram Chalfi is Yehuda Amichai. We'll see a poem by Yehuda Amichai in the selection. After that is Rachel Moore Purgo. We'll see a poem by her at the end. She's the first modern Hebrew woman poet. And then after that is a contemporary poet named Ruchama Weiss, who is a colleague of mine at Hebrew Union College, the only living poet in the book. I had had this remarkable experience of studying with Ruchama one-on-one. I'm looking at Agi Vito, who's on this call. She's a fellow Maharat student. When I was at Maharat, we were given a grant to be able to study, to get coaching from whoever we wanted. And I chose actually to study with Ruchama, who is a Talmudist and also a pioneering practitioner of bibliotherapy. And we studied Gemara together for therapeutic purposes as a way of getting at deep psychological and emotional issues. And I had no idea until I started teaching her poetry that she had actually written a poem about the Gemara in Shabbat 66b, which is the gloss on Habanim Yotzim Biksharim, and that she had specifically responded to that interpretation of about Rashi's daughters. And so I'm going to read it. I hope that it's okay that I'm going to read it in Hebrew and then in English. So this is her poem, Kina al Bnot Rashi, Lament on Rashi's Daughters. She cites at the beginning this quotation that I've shared with you already from the Gemara in Shabbat, and also Rashi's interpretation. איך ישבו מרים, יוכבד ועוד אחד שלא הושאר לה שם? כך למדנו בבית הספר לבנות. ישבו לילה לאחר שנסתלק אחרון התלמידים. מזגו חמין לאבא, ליטפו את מילותיו, כתבו את פירושיו, בכוחות אחרונים בעיניים אחוזות פיהוק. כתבו באהבה ובגעגוע, גם פירוש זה האחרון, ואינו מגעגע עליהם? ואין לו אהבה יתרה, ואין לו רפואה ששייכת בנקבות, נגזר עליהן לכתוב ולהמתין בידיים כבדות ובגעגוע שאין לו מענה, להמתין שיחבבן בסופן, שיום אחד אולי יגעגע, אולי ישמע געגוען, אם בו נכדיו רבנו תם והרשב"ם זכותם תגן עלינו. How they sat, Miriam, Yocheved, and yet another daughter left without a name. That's what we learned in girls' school. Night after night, they sat after the last student left. They poured hot drinks for father, caressed his words, wrote down his commentaries. On their last legs with yawning eyes, they wrote with love, with longing, this last commentary too. And he doesn't miss them and has no extra love. He has no remedy of relevance to females. It was decreed that they should write and wait with heavy hands and unrequited longing. They should wait for him finally to show them fondness. One day, perhaps, he will long for them or hear their longings with the coming of his grandsons, Rabbeinu Tam and the Rashbam. Their merit should protect us. So what this poem is recognizing is the historical fact that Rashi didn't have any sons. He only had daughters. And as we famously know, he had actually 3 named daughters, Miriam, Yocheved, Rachel, and yet there was another child that died early. And that these daughters reputedly were the ones who transcribed his commentaries. And so the great question, and dare I say, outrage of the poem is the thought that they might have actually had to read this and transcribed this particular commentary. And that nevertheless, despite this kind of kick in the face, right, this feeling of the text assaulting you as you're trying to connect to it, they maintained their connection. They didn't leave. They stayed in the game, and they waited, like they longed. Despite the denial of their longings, they longed, and they demonstrated this longing through their fidelity. And that ultimately, they gave birth to these famous rabbinic sons, Rashi's grandsons, who will go on to be Rashi's most famous interlocutors and disputants. I mean, I remember, perhaps Agi can commiserate with this, I remember the feeling sometimes of shock at the temerity and the vociferousness of the disagreement between Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi. For example, on the subject of tefillin, Uh, and I wondered, I speculated, I sort of midrashically uh, fantasized that perhaps these sons, these grandsons, had internalized their mother's sense of not being entirely appreciated, and that might have been transferred in some respect to their relationship with, the way in which they engaged in Milcham Tashel Torah, like the war of Torah with their grandfather. But of course, their disputation was also the highest form of compliment. What this poem showed to me was the importance of finding a way to persist, like trying to find a way to tie a knot, even when someone is perhaps poised against you or making it difficult for you. Okay, so as I said, the third poet that I taught for quite a long time, and this um, began in the fall of COVID when we were not attending shul. We were in this carried us through the Yamim Noraim of that first COVID year, when most of us were praying outside in backyard synagogues and so on. So from the fall of 2020 to through the winter of 2021, when my Kaddish for my mother ended, I was teaching Yehuda Amichai. And in fact, this poem that I'm sharing with you, which is Knots and Talit related, was the poem that I taught the very first morning after my Kaddish ended for my mother. So after 22 straight months of saying Kaddish, I did not stop attending Minyan. I've not stopped since. I've got very knotted into a certain way of liturgical and ritual way of being as a result of this experience. And I realized that I needed to address the question of continuity in the face of disruption. And that, of course, is what Kaddish and grieving is writ large. Like, how does one maintain a connection in the face of the cataclysmic disruption of a death in the family? And how does one maintain one's theological mindset in that context? That's why I would argue we say Kaddish, because grief and death and mortality are the largest assault that anyone could experience on our God concept, especially since so often we figure God as a parent. And so when a parent dies, it creates a crisis for us. And then through this Kaddish experience, you tie yourself to a regimen that becomes so second nature that it's almost impossible not to utter those words. That morning, after my Kaddish ended, there were 3 times that I started saying Kaddish. I had to stop myself. And so I wanted to reckon with what it means to maintain something even when one stops doing it. And this poem by Yehuda Amichai, um, whoever wrapped in a talit, Mishi hitatef betalit be'nuarav, is really about the continuity of connection to the life of mitzvot, even when one stops that life of mitzvot. So Yehuda Amichai, who was born in 1923 in Germany and then immigrated to Palestine in the 1930s, like before the war, um, was raised Orthodox and left the life of Orthodox observance as a kid, a teenager. And yet he wrote very poignantly about the effect of a life of mitzvot on his adult life. And this particular poem, I'll go to the next slide and read it in English. It's about translating the experience of religiosity into a secular form, translating childhood into adulthood, translating visceral experiences into other visceral experiences. And in many respects, it's a meditation on 2 things. Number one, on metaphor, on the yoking together of disparate elements to try and look at something familiar in an unfamiliar way, a defamiliarized and renewed way. But it's also about translation, how one translates one experience into a new form, how one metamorphoses it. So this is the poem. Whoever was wrapped in a talit in youth will never forget taking it out of the soft velvet bag, opening the folded talit, spreading it out, kissing the length of the neckband, some neckbands embroidered, others trimmed in gold. After that, with a great unfurling overhead like a sky, a wedding canopy, a parachute, and then winding it around your head as if playing hide and seek, and then wrapping your whole body in it so close, tucking into it like the cocoon of a butterfly, then opening up as if with wings to fly. And why is the talit striped and not checkered black and white like a chessboard? Because squares are finite and hopeless. Stripes come from endlessness and go to endlessness, like runways in an airport where angels land and take off. Whoever is wrapped in talit will never forget when you climb out of the swimming pool or the sea, you wrap your head in a large towel, spread it out again over your head, and again tuck into it so close, and still shiver a bit and laugh and bless. So, what is so remarkable about this poem is that it shows how, despite this disruption of no longer wrapping in a talit in adulthood, that the experience endures and it transforms and it continues in a kind of endlessness. And the similes, right? Like the various similes that, like a sky, like a wedding canopy, like a parachute, they both open up to this kind of experience of endlessness, but they're also they also communicate the awareness of something lost or the fear of something lost. So this idea that the talit opens up for you like a sky, suggests a connectedness to heaven. And the wedding canopy, of course, reminds us of being, enveloped with another person and bringing someone else into that experience, not doing it in a lonely way. But the parachute suggests perhaps the need to escape, like the parachute out of a wedding that might have come to its end. So that sense perhaps of disconnection, but then again, the parachute also communicates a tremendous sense of faith, because after all, if you jump out of a plane, you have to have great faith that that parachute is going to open and that there is going to be a continuity between sky and earth, one that is not going to undo you. And so the poem explores these kinds of ramifications and alternative possibilities, and the sense of metamorphosis that it can occur as a continuity rather than just a disruption. That the experience of religiosity, even if it's discontinued in its conventional form, that it can be conjured up again in the experience of going to the beach. And suddenly putting on a beach towel is a re-evocation of connectedness to family, connectedness to youth, connectedness to faith. The poetry of Rachel Luzzatto Morpurgo has been a fascination and an infatuation of mine for a very, very long time. She's featured in my first book that Rav Shmuley mentioned, the book And Rachel Stole the Idols, on the emergence of the first modern Hebrew women writers. Rachel Luzzatto Morpurgo is someone who ought to be a household name, especially among Orthodox Jews, given that she was the first modern Hebrew woman poet and she was a devout Orthodox Jew. She is from the famed Luzzatto family, as in Shmuel David Luzzatto, the famous 19th century maskil. He was, Shmuel David Luzzatto was Rachel Luzzatto Morpurgo's first chavruta. He was her first cousin. Her great uncle was Rabbi Moses Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramachal, the Kabbalist, Messianist, and writer on matters of ethics, as well as a poet. Rachel Luzzatto Morpurgo was a poet and yet a devout woman her entire life, and really a person ahead of her time. I taught her poetry the whole 5-month, 6-month period before my ordination at Maharat. And in many respects, I looked to her as a kind of prototypical, like proto female rabbinical student, because she was someone who had achieved great knowledge in Talmud, in Kabbalah, in all classical sources. All of her poetry is highly learned and elusive. Um, and yet, sadly, most people don't know about her. And so part of my goal was to bring awareness to her in this book, and in my own spiritual life, as someone who could be a potential addition to our liturgy. There are a number of poems in the book that could be read as tefillot if communities would choose to do so. There's a poem that she wrote for her wedding and for a cousin's wedding that could be incorporated in a contemporary wedding ceremony. I chose to share this one with you today because it has the theme of going out with knots, of being connected in the face of disruption. Um, and to the best of our knowledge, I say our knowledge because I have been in a kind of chavruta about Ruchel Lutata Murpurgo with a professor of Hebrew literature at Bar Ilan University. I always have to mention her when I teach this material. Her name is Tova Cohen, and she really is the foremost expert on Ruchel Lutata Murpurgo, like on earth. The next slide we'll see will include a reference to her book, but actually I can hold it up in front of you. So this is her monumental edition of Rachel Lutata Morpurgo's poetry called Ugav Ne'elam. To the best of our knowledge, this is the first poem written by a female poet in Hebrew that is dedicated to another woman. So just having women write Hebrew poetry was a major development. It's like a shocking thing to note, but until Rachel Morpurgo, there had never been a book of Hebrew poetry authored by a woman at all. So from the time of the end of the canonization of the Bible to the end of the 19th century, in fact, wasn't a single book at all in the Hebrew language written by a woman until the end of the 19th century. So in 1881, you got a novel by a woman named Sarah Fega Meinken-Foner. So that's like the first prose work. And Rachel Morpurgo's poetry was the first book of poems written by a woman. We had like a handful of poems, one by one woman in Kurdistan and one by woman in Morocco, and maybe a 10th century poem by the unnamed wife of Dunash ben Labrat. Right? There, all in all, we don't even have two handfuls of works by women in the Hebrew language until the modern period. And then along comes Rachel Morpurgo. So this is a poem that she wrote when her cousin and very close friend, Rachel, who was Luzzata, was going to be marrying a man named Sulam, that was his last name, and moving to Padua. This is the poem that she wrote for the wedding. I'm going to read it in Hebrew because you need to hear it, to hear how important the form of this poem is to its meaning and to its message. Lazot yikareh hefziba. So this is a reference to Isaiah, where Bnei Israel, the people of Israel, are referred to as hefziba. My delight is with her. And so that itself is an innovation, because instead of using this language to talk about God and Israel, like a hetero, a man and woman love story, this is between two loving friends and relatives. Rachel im Rachel niksheret, כענק עלי גרגרת, אהבתך לי תפארת, על ראשי הנך כותרת. טוב טעמך מכל פרפרת לי ינעם, אך את סותרת החברה, להיות נבחרת מסולם אל עיר אחרת. שיר זאת הינה מזכרת, אהבה להיות נהדרת, הומיה אני שוררת. יום אל יום אשמע איגרת דברי שלום, גם אוגרת לשלומו רחל עטרת. So before I read the translation, of course, I imagine you all heard the eret, 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 obsessive rhyme. And that is not incidental. It is a difficult thing to do this, maybe less difficult in Hebrew than other languages, but it is a rare thing to see an A rhyme scheme. That kind of obsessive repetition of the same sound. And I would argue that this is because Rachel is niksheret, she is tied to this close female friend and relative, and this tying is about to be broken. The knot is about to be untied by the fact that this relative, that this other Rachel, and let's remember they both have the same name, that this other Rachel is moving far away. And this is at a time when the distance from Trieste, Italy to Padua was significant, and there was no device like this. There was no way of being able to see each other easily, no telephones and so on. This is, in the mid 19th century. And so the sound, the intonation, the repetition of that same sound is a way of kind of trying to conjure up a continuity in the face of this broken tie. And the poem is a way of trying to retie a knot in the face of a potential sundering. Rachel and Rachel are connected like necklace to a neck. Your love is my laurel, on my head a crowning glory. To me, your wisdom is prized above all desert, but you're leaving our small cohort to be lifted tall on a ladder. Their husband's name is Sulam, on a ladder in another capital. This poem is a memento of love now absent. Longingly I chant. Daily shall I send mail, bearing greetings to regale. I'm being blocked here. Solomon and his jewel Rachel. So I tried as best as I could to conjure up some, like reproduce some version of the rhyme, but it's impossible in English to do that without it becoming like inordinately clunky. But what I want to call attention to, first of all, is how significant it is to have a Rachel writing about a Rachel. And this particular Rachel Morpurgo was also very much aware of the significance of her own name. All of these early Hebrew women writers wrote very intentionally about biblical women because they knew they didn't have predecessor figures. They didn't have models around them. And so they had to look back to the distant past. So this is a Rachel who herself had written several poems about the biblical Rachel, meditating on the significance of their shared name and wanting to maintain the glory of this friendship, even though a guy was coming between them and that they were no longer going to see one another. The poem is densely elusive to Yeshayahu, to Proverbs, to Psalms, but instead, in contrast to these traditional sources that imagine, let's say, the necklace around the neck, that idea of being, of hanging on to the wisdom of your parents, like the necklace around the neck. We see that in the book of Mishlei in Proverbs. It's something again, something different to imagine wisdom shared not between parents and child, but between two women. Or love shared not between man and woman, but between two loving friends. And I remembered very fondly reflecting on the significance of their tie, their deep tie to one another in the context of my studying for Smicha and Maharat and the strong bonds that I developed with my own chavruta. My question is whether I have 5 minutes to do one more, or I should wrap it up.
Yes, please do.
Excellent. So here, as I promised, is the cover of Tova Cohen's book, Ugav Ne'elam. Rachel Morpurgo's book was called Ugav Rachel, Rachel's harp. And it was published posthumously by her town rabbi, a rabbi named Yaakov Castiglione. So what Tova Cohen did is she took the Ugav part and she used it to do like a scholarly edition of that poetry, which includes many not many important notes. And if you're interested in her, I would urge you to look at that book. I also have a good deal of attention to Rachel Morpurgo in my first book, and Rachel Still the Idols. So I wanted to close with Leah Goldberg, who is the poet that I open with in the book. I talk about the experience that I had as a young doctoral student, going to Hebrew University and being sent to the Har HaTzofim, the Mount Scopus Library, to get the books that I needed to prepare for my survey of Hebrew poetry class with the foremost professors of Hebrew poetry at the time, Gershon Shaked and Dan Miron. There was no such thing as a reading packet. There was no such thing as Canvas. They said, go to the library and get the books. And so I go to the library and I take one of the assigned books off the shelf and I open it up and I notice a book plate on the front that says Ex Libris from the library in Misifriat Leah Goldberg. And I realized that Leah Goldberg, who it was the first, I would say, truly canonical Hebrew woman poet, born in Königsberg, immigrated to Palestine in 1935. She goes on to have this illustrious career as a poet, as an editor, as a children's writer, as a novelist, as a playwright, a translator from many languages. And the founder of the comparative literature department at Hebrew University. And when she passed away in 1970, tragically young, her entire library was donated to the Hebrew University. And so when I opened up that book, I realized that I was opening up Leah Goldberg's own copy of that poet. And I was so moved. At this point, I was a doctoral student in Hebrew literature. I sat down on the floor in the library of Mount Scopus and just started to cry. And so here is an example of, and Leah Goldberg, in addition to all the other things I said about her, she was a visual artist. And so these Ex Libris book plates were hers, were drawings that she did. And so my book includes one of these Ex Libris book plates because it was such a visceral early experience for me in studying her poetry. Leah Goldberg also lost her father pretty tragically. Her father, the whole family was exiled from Vilna during World War, actually from Kovno, I believe, and during World War I. And when they came back after the end of the war, her father was arrested for being a suspected spy and tortured and imprisoned, and this broke him down emotionally to the point where he was never able to resume life with a family again. And Leah, who had been extremely close with him, describes experience of going on business trips with him in the way that I describe experiences of going with my father places. She was very much bereft. It was an very early trauma, and something that she rehearsed in different forms in her work, this loss of a father. In the absence of her father, she became very close to her mother. And so in my experience of having lost my father and moving my mother close by to me, Leah Goldberg lived with her mother till the end of her life. She never married. She shared an apartment with her mom. I was very drawn to this poem, and this is the first poem that I talk about in the book. And I include it with a portrait that I drew of my mother when I was a young adult, that I painted of my mother. So this is Litmunat Ima. I'm going to read the poem in Hebrew and English, and then I'm going to read something from the book, if it's okay. Theological question. תמונתך כה שלווה, את אחרת, קצת גאה ונבוכה על שאת עימי, מלווה בדמעה ובחיוך מוותרת, ומעולם אינך שואלת מי. Your picture's so tranquil, you're other, a bit proud and confused, you're my mother. You guide with tear and conceding smile too, and never do you question who. לא תמת, לא רגזת, באתי אלייך מדי יום ביומו ואמרתי, תני, את הכל הבאת לי במו ידייך, רק מפני שאני, אני. Never wondering, never raging when I came to you saying, give. Each day the same, bringing me all with your own hands, just because I am what I am. ויותר ממני, את היום זוכרת את יגון ילדותי, ונפשך כבר פתרה, עת תבוא אלייך הבת הבוגרת, היא תביא את ייאוש תוגתה שבגרה. And today, better than I, you recall my childhood sorrow, how your mind solved it all. When your grown-up daughter would come home, she'd bring sorrow's despair fully grown. כן, אבוא רצוצה ולא אשאל לשלומך, לא אבכה בחיקך, לא אלחש עמי, את תדעי, זה שעזבני היה לי יקר ממך, ולא תשאליני מי. Without greeting, I came home shattered. Without crying in your arm or whispering, mother, you'd know he who left me was dearer to me than you. Yet you'd never ask me who. So this is a poem about a daughter recognizing that there's an asymmetry in the relationship of mothers and daughters, that mothers are always going to give more to their daughters than their daughters are going to give back. That there's it's not an equal give and take, and that there was a certain kind of unconditional love that she could always expect from her mother, even when she didn't treat her well, even when she didn't always deserve it. And when I pondered that poem early on in my morning experience, when I was encountering, number one, an absence of women's voices, but also an absence of female imagery of God, any sort of theologizing that would incorporate a woman's point of view. I looked at this poem and I wondered, is it possible that this poem is something more than just about a fleshly mother, but might it also be about a potential female conception of God? And so this is what I write in my book, and I'll close with that. And if anyone has questions, I'll be happy to answer. What then if God were a mother? What would it mean to go to shul and address prayers and petitions to a divine mother who is other and transcendent, but also immanent and deeply present, even needy like my own mother? What would it mean to laud and to beseech a mother who cries over our tears and swells with pride over our accomplishments, who sits with us in our trials and also manages to give us the latitude to err, lose, falter, grow, and mature? And what would it mean to honor with all one's being a mother who always allows us to, quote, come home to her in all of our thoughtlessness and self-absorption, knowing full well that as flawed human beings, we are often more concerned with ourselves than with her. So that was, I'm ending with the very beginning of my journey, at least the beginning of the journey of the book, in terms of the first poem that I taught. And I suppose I'll end here if you have other questions, if anybody would like to ask any questions about the Two Kaddish project in general, or about the other poets in the book, or anything at all. And if not, I'll say thank you and wish you all a Gmar Tov. Hi, Aggie.
Hi, thank you so much for this really beautiful presentation and introduction to these poets. I never actually, I'm one of these ignorant people who now is going to buy these volumes. I did not know about Rachel. What's her name? Burkurfo. And I find these poems are beautiful, and I actually really regret that there is not more from Rashi engaging with, I mean, he just solved the problem, so to speak, very, very simply. He just said, well, they don't, fathers don't love their daughters so much, and they don't long for their father either. And I think that these two poems were a fantastic rejoinder to this very simple treatment. And I just want to hear more of that. And I can totally, what you said resonated with me. I also had a much actually closer relationship with my father, and it's actually good to hear that, you know, the what the mother can feel about that, right? Because it's not just the Rashi doesn't just hurt the daughter, but it can also be, these women also said, well, the mother is hurt when the daughters do love their father more. So thank you so much. I just wanted to say it was a beautiful introduction for me, and I'm going to think more about these issues. And I have to go now, but this was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
But thank you so much, Rabbi Wendy. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to our community. And before we go, I did want to let everyone know that our next class is October 16th, titled Shemitah, a year devoted to social justice. And the link to sign up for our classes will be wherever this video is posted. So I hope that you will all join us and have a very meaningful Yom Kippur.